I'm going to switch to English. I'm sorry. My Italian is horrible after 10 years of not using it. So if I'm speaking too quickly, say slow down, okay? All right. So look, we have a lot of headlines about cybersecurity right now. Russia, China, North Korea. It's hard to avoid the political implications of cybersecurity, right? You all are on the front lines, and we'll be on the front lines, of looking at the forensics of this, the technology behind it. How do we understand code and think about how people have created it and what it means? That's a really important role. But the other side of the equation that you're going to have to think through is the ethics of this. What should we do with the information we have? How do we talk about bad things that are happening online? Should we talk about them publicly? Should you tell a government? What do you do when you're faced with the implications of the technology that you're looking at or even creating? Are you creating Frankenstein, or are you creating something that will change people's lives for the better? I'm sure that you're getting an education here that is very well-rounded in a sense, but no one's been able to prepare us for the level of challenges that we have in technology. So I think you're in a really exciting field, and also a very exciting time to be coming into the technology workforce. What I'm going to do today in this short lecture is talk about a few different aspects of technology, and then the dark side of it, security. I'll talk about some of the nation-state threats that we've seen, especially in the US, but also in other parts of the world and in Europe, and what those threats have looked like and how we think about them. And then I'll talk a little bit about the good side and the brighter side of this, which is, what do we do with the amount of data that we have? How do we think about artificial intelligence and machine learning, data analytics, pick your favorite buzzword, right? And what are you going to do with that? What fields make sense to apply everything that you're learning here? All right, let's start with the scary stuff first, okay? So, I'm going to give you a nation-state actor. And what I will do is kind of give you a little phrase for how to think about that nation-state in how we've seen them act. Think of this as a kind of protagonista, and I will explain what their character is like, and then walk you through the experience that we've had dealing with these different threats from the US side. The first is China. So go all the way back to 2004, 2005. You guys were little kids. Thank you, someone laughed. Okay. Okay, so go back about 10, 15 years. China starts thinking, we have to modernize our military. We've got to figure out how to be a global power. How are we going to defend our enormous maritime borders, in addition to becoming a country that can sit on stage on par with the United States, European countries, Russia, what have you. And in that push to modernize China's military, they needed a lot of research and development, intellectual property. You have to figure out how to build whatever the system might be, a GPS system for a fighter jet, or a weapons system. And in order to get some of that know-how, the Chinese military started hacking defense contractors. The Boeings, the big airplane producers, the big defense contractors in the US. And we like to say there's two types of secrets in Washington. Ones that don't matter, and ones that are too good to keep. This fell into the second category. A lot of people knew about it, but was stopping the US from being able to talk about this threat and to talk about the technology behind it was the inability to connect the IT problem, malware, to who was behind it and why they were doing these hacks. So connecting the technical information to basically the human information. And here's what happened. Before we were able to make that link and be able to talk about this problem and respond to it, a lot more hacking took place. Shocking, right? So because the military data was really successful via hacking, the next place that this Chinese military group started to go was towards the private sector. Some of the sectors and verticals where information was stolen included green energy, pharmaceuticals, high-end manufacturing. I'll give you an example. One time my company, we were doing an investigation at the time. Companies would only call us if they had a really big problem that they couldn't solve themselves. Something was very wrong on the network. Taking a look, and we're able to see what documents were exfiltrated, were taken from the network, and looks like blueprints of a factory of some sort. Well, we're showing this to the company. We say, look, we think that the blueprints for one of your manufacturing plants were stolen. And they said, you know what's funny about that? Our partner in China asked several of our engineers to come and visit our plant in China, or their plant in China, rather. And when the engineers walked into the plant to help try to find the problem with the system in the plant, they started to look around and say, I've seen this place before. It was the exact blueprints of the building that had been in the US. And the difference was they hadn't gotten the latest set of blueprints, so they were one version behind in the manufacturing blueprints for that other factory. What it showed, and what a lot of different stories that came out of that time period illustrated, was this was a wholesale effort to get at the underlying economic and military information that would be key to how China would be able to grow its economy. And like I said, economic security was national security, one for one, in the way that China was pursuing its goals. So if they were able to have a military and also state-owned enterprises, companies that were competitive at a national level and international level, these would be the sort of hallmarks that showed that China was secure. So think of that as kind of the understanding of what was motivating this type of hacking. All right, now, like I said, there was this big gap between the technical understanding of what was happening and people behind it, and agencies behind it. So what did we do? This was when I was working for a company called Mandiant. We were seeing these investigations, these breaches, firefights, if you will, right? With all of this forensic data that was coming out of the networks that we were investigating. And by looking into that code and attributes about that code, how it was commanded to do different functions, where the addresses were registered, what language setting it was in, what time zone it was being created and compiled in, the types of details that you all will be familiar with if you've had any experience with code. Those were the details we started compiling. And through analysis over time, we were able to get enough detail to explain that this was a Chinese military unit based in Shanghai. And with that understanding, we said, look, we're a private cybersecurity company. And we're sitting here with the privilege of looking at all of this data from individual clients, individual companies, who on their own would not be able to talk about this, right? Because it's their own proprietary information, it was too much. But if we were seated above that and were able to look at all this data and explain what we believed to be the attribution behind this technical data, that would help people understand the scope of the problem, the scope of the industrial espionage that we were seeing. We released that report in 2013, and it became the initial point where people could finally connect the ones and zeros to the people, the agency, and the motivation behind them. All right, I don't tell you this just to be proud of this report. I tell you this because it was people who were interested in investigating the data in a very clear and analytic way, partnering with people who understood the technical aspects of code, like you all do, and being able to say, what can I infer? What can I assess? What can I make a judgment upon based on these forensic details? And then we needed the political scientists of the world, the writers, the thinkers who were able to say, this is how we need to explain this. This is how we need to make assessments around it to make it real to people. And the asymmetric effect, if you will, of a report like that, the ability for it to have an enormous impact, came over the next couple of years. Finally, governments could talk about this problem of industrial espionage, and then going further, they were able to start taking steps to respond. I'll give you some examples. In 2014, the Department of Justice in the United States, the main law enforcement ministry, if you will, indicted 5 Chinese military officers. Said, look, these are 5 people representative of this industrial espionage that we're seeing through hacking. At the time, everyone kind of laughed at this in America. They said, give me a break. Do you think China is going to stop hacking intellectual property because there's 5 pictures of PLA officers? This won't change anything. Okay. Flash forward into 2015. And the threat of sanctions starts to sort of leak out that America is going to stop purchasing Chinese products if America judges that the property behind it, the intellectual property in the products, had been hacked. That threat of sanctions, plus those indictments, and then finally an agreement that happened in September 2015 between President Obama and President Xi. Each one of those steps, in and of itself, was sort of seen as too small, didn't matter. But what we saw on the other side, on the forensic side, where the truth lies, right, was the Chinese groups that had been doing all of this hacking for years had greatly subsided. They weren't doing as much. Actually, we hadn't even seen an instance of intellectual property or R&D stolen since the agreement, since President Obama and President Xi's agreement. So what does this tell us? It tells us that if you're focused over time, if you're clear about the rule, the norm that you're trying to set, and if you have a persistent combination of private sector data, interest, and pressure, government interest and pressure, you're able to create rules of the road in a very complex space, in cyberspace. Right now, you guys can't avoid the feeling that I think most of us have, which is government feels outdated, the private sector feels like it has a power that we've never grappled with before. Everything in society is a little bit up for grabs, right? We're sort of looking for how do you create a new book of rules in light of how much our society has changed in the last 10, 15 years, right? And it's examples like this that will help us start to build a sense of what we can rely on again. What works? How do you change behavior at a national level and also at a personal level? Now let's talk about the personal level for a second. And for that example, I'm going to use Russia as the protagonista, again, for explaining a different aspect of cybersecurity. With Russia, I like to use the phrase, perceptions are reality. So back in 2000, again, so much of this starts kind of at the same time, but back in 2000, Putin comes to office, and along with Putin's rise comes a Russian government document called the Information Security Document. And it's a really useful layout for how Russia, but also other countries, were defining cyberspace. And it was very different than how the US was defining cyberspace. I'll explain it. Think of a cartoon bubble, fumetto in Italiano, no? Un fumetto sopra il paese, okay? And in that fumetto is all of the information, the collective thoughts and opinions of people, okay? Russia considers this the information sphere. And this information sphere is something that they see as a sovereign territory, okay? And in 2000, this is incredibly prescient, incredibly ahead of its time, right? To think that your reality is also set in this information place. Now, you and I walk around with our iPhones, right? And we'll check the news, we'll check social media, and that's a reality that you're also living in. The Russian government just kind of understood it in this way before the iPhone, way before the iPhone came out, okay? So in this information sphere, Russia sees an important role for the state, for the government. And that is to protect the opinions, the information, the sphere that they see as sovereign territory. All right, don't worry. You're going to see how this matters in a second. Okay, so you have this information sphere, this fumetto, where all these thoughts are that Russia needs to defend. All right, fast forward a little bit into 2010. The Russian military puts out this very interesting strategy called a doctrine. And they say, we're going to use the information sphere, the same fumetto, in order to change world opinion to favorably predispose people's opinions to the Russian use of force. That's basically saying, look, we're going to manage perceptions, we're going to figure out how to manage the information situation in order to achieve state objectives, in this case in a military sense. Let me give you a contrast to why this is really interesting. In the US at the same time, the Department of Defense is thinking about cybersecurity in much more concrete terms. Networks, systems, how do we defend against cyber threats in a very sort of concrete and technical way. Nowhere is there this broader sense that protecting the information assets at a psychological level is something that the government would do or should do, right? So you have this very technical and grounded mindset to cybersecurity, typified by the US and numerous European countries. And then you have the Russian version, which other countries adopt as well, which includes the technical and the concrete aspects, but also these more psychological elements, okay? All right, you're gonna see how these collide, right, in 2016 in the US and in other places, but here we have a very small version of how we think of cyberspace, and then a much more encompassed version of how we think about cyberspace on the Russian side. All right, now to 2014, 4 years later. One of the big questions in the security research community was, how good is the Russian government at hacking? We know Russia's really good from a technical education standpoint. We're seeing these doctrines, these sort of government statements and government layouts for how to think about this information space. So where's the data? Where are we seeing are there attacks? Why aren't we seeing them? Are they so good that we can't find them? Kind of boogeyman theory, right? And this was the question in a huge way for years in the defense community. And what happened in 2014 is we started to see some malware that was calling back to a Ministry of Internal Affairs in Georgia, country in the Caucasus. Interesting, right? Doesn't say, oh, it's Russia, but wow, is that interesting? A couple more things happened. We started looking at the code used in a couple of other similar attacks, the malware. It showed a few things. The compile times when the code was written, consistently over a 7-year period, was built from about 9 a.m. to 6 p.m. in Moscow's time zone with breaks on Russian government holidays and time for lunch, okay? Again, not the reason it's Russia, but another interesting point of evidence, right? Language settings, Russian, okay? And then the way the tool was built, and this is the really interesting piece if you're involved in building software, right? The way that the tools were built showed that the developers behind it were interested in creating code that had a sort of ability to stay in a network for a long time, anti-forensic techniques, so if a researcher was trying to sort of unpack the code, it would be more difficult for them. And then it also showed that they wanted to change how the second part of the malware was delivered over time depending on the target. All right, that doesn't mean much if you're not in the malware world, but what it meant if you dug in on this and if you asked the right questions was it showed people who were thinking, how do I develop code to use over time without having to rebuild it from scratch every time I need to use it, and something that's flexible enough that they could change targets with it, and obviously something that had been planned out by a group of people over time, showing a certain amount of resourcing. This wasn't someone who built it in their basement overnight or cut and paste code from some script somewhere, right? This was a really well-resourced effort. All right, so we have the language settings, the compile times, the ways the tools were built, and then finally we have the targets. Ministries of Defense, Ministries of Foreign Affairs, the emails of defense attaches, other information that is really only valuable if you're a government or a military. Now, I spent a lot of time walking through those details because it's that level of forensic analysis of different data points being explained to understand the implications of them that made it clear in 2014 when we said, This evidence is why we believe this group likely works for the Russian government. We didn't know how. We didn't know what agency. We didn't know if they were contractors. But we could say, based on these forensic details, this operation is most likely the work of someone working for the Russian government. This became what is called Advanced Persistent Threat 28, APT 28. All right, that's 2014. Write this report to the world. Everyone says, great, Russia spies, so does everybody else. Okay, cool. On we go. I mean, countries have been spying on each other since before there were countries, right? Ancient Greece, okay? So nothing to see here. Everyone kind of moved on with their life. All right. Then 2016 comes along. Now remember the fumetto? The construction of how Russia sees cyberspace. Remember this data point from 2014 where we're able to get the forensics that add up to this Russian government hacking group. Now it's 2016. The DNC, the Democratic National Committee, the party behind Hillary and Bernie in the 2016 election, out comes this public batch of documents, of emails, from the DNC's server that are propagated, sort of talked about, by this figure called Guccifer 2.0. This is June 2016. All right, cybersecurity community, Guccifer, the name, had been known as this Romanian cybercriminal. Well, Guccifer 2.0 can't speak Romanian. Kind of weird. Then we start to see more. The documents are coming out on WikiLeaks, and then the investigation behind the DNC's network reveals the same tools, the same malware that was used by APT-28, that had been used to identify APT-28 back in 2014, before there was any election or anything else, right? All right, so why did it take a year, practically, before people really understood that we were looking at a foreign government's interference in elections, but writ large, that we were looking at a different type of action in cyberspace? This wasn't industrial espionage, and this wasn't regular old ancient Greece onward espionage for political means. This was something really different. And the way to understand it is to understand the theory behind it. Using information as a weapon, using information to change perceptions, to change opinions. This is a combination of a technical and a psychological use of cyberspace. And it's been very difficult for people to wrap their mind around the psychological side of this because it doesn't quite feel like anything that we've seen before because it fits in so well with the information that we're consuming, right? Let's make this real. You're in your Facebook news feed. Who has Facebook? Thank you, everyone, right? Okay, you're in your Facebook news feed, and what pops up in the news feed? Is it your mom's stuff, or is it your friend's stuff? What pops up in your news feed is the most engaging type of content. That's how the news feed is written, right? Behind all of this tech, and not just Facebook, behind so many of the different tech applications that we have today, the goal of what needs to get in front of your eyeballs and keep your attention is what will engage you most. What will make you spend the most time there? What will make you most invested in the experience on your screen, right? So what was most engaging? Negativity, extremist content, a boring article with a lot of nuance. That's not going to be the top of your news feed. It's not going to be the top of a news site, what have you, right? And one of the less told stories of 2016 is there was one word that algorithms, right? I don't need to explain what an algorithm is to this crowd, but that algorithms kept picking up as the word that would make stories jump to the top of whatever you were looking at, whatever program you were looking at, or news source, or news feed, or what have you. And it didn't really matter what context this word was in, as long as that word was there, the algorithms would say, this needs to be prioritized. Want to guess what the word was? Trump. I don't say that in a political way. I say it in simply a way that algorithms that were built to choose the content that was most engaging, had the word Trump in it. And it's an example of how engagement and attention has very much been prioritized into how this information space, this fumetto, operates, right? You're seeing what's most engaging, what's most tantalizing, what's most sensational, what you're most willing to share, what you're also most willing to share your opinion on or violently disagree with. And it was because of this changing environment in our information spheres that each of us have that allows for not just Russia, but whoever's interested in changing your mind. Your guard is down, you're primed, you're already set to be looking at something that you want to agree with or want to violently disagree with. And it's that change in how we think about information and how information is presented to us that gives actors a perfect backdoor into your mind. And one that's a lot harder to see than we've ever had to deal with before. So we use Russia. I'm using Russia today as an example for how this works. And also because I think that the way that the Russian government had thought about this for 18 years has been a really prescient outlook about how much information in the place that you live, this information sphere, how much it would matter in our lives, and how easily it can be manipulated for good and for bad. All right, so let's leave Russia for a minute. Let's talk North Korea. Okay, so with North Korea, I'm going to give you this headline: money and attention. Does anyone remember Sony and when Sony was hacked in 2014? Couple nods? Okay. The movie that the crisis revolved around wasn't even very good either, the interview. But what happened was this. December 2014, late November 2014, Sony's computers were wiped out. Not just data stolen, not emails taken, wiped out, okay? The company goes to a point where they've got to go find, remember those credit card machines? Maybe you guys don't actually, that had that you have to press really hard on them and it would make an imprint of the credit card. It was before we had the electronic card readers. They had to go find those and pull them out of the basement at Sony Studios so that people could buy their lunch in the cafeteria, right? This is how much Sony was down. Nothing worked, right? All right, out come emails that had been stolen before all of the computers were wiped. But in essence, Sony's down to nothing. They're not functioning. Why? 3-4 times ahead of that, North Korea had basically said, if you release this movie, which was a satire, a parody, about the Korean leader, we will take you down, Sony. And at the time, everyone at Sony, et cetera, dismissed this. It sort of was like, no, of course we're going to put out a movie. We're a movie studio. You know, we don't really care if your feelings are hurt, right? But in Korea's mind, North Korea's mind, this was very much an interference in that information sphere, right? This was attacking the perception of North Korea on the world stage. It was making fun of and embarrassing North Korea, and it was worth threatening this company to save face and save their image. As such, Sony gets hacked, and it's the first attribution of a cyber attack by the US government. It says North Korea was behind this, was a state-sponsored act, and there will be a response. So what does that tell us? Back to my attention and money for North Korea, and I'll get to the money part in a second. So what that starts to tell us is attention and understanding of reputation is an incredibly important factor as different actors are considering what they're going to do in cyberspace. And it's also a bargaining chip. It is the commodity, in a sense, of our age is attention, right? Whether you're Netflix, do you have Netflix in Italy? Yeah? Okay. Netflix CEO, I love his quote. He said, our competitor isn't HBO, it's sleep. Right? This is about how, in the information age, it's about how I get your eyeballs. It's how I get your attention. And North Korea is really good at it when it takes Sony down, right? Now North Korea is a huge cyber player in the world of defense and assessing nation-state capability. But here's the thing. Attention doesn't build you government forces. It doesn't build your economy. You still need money, right? So what's the other side of this? It's an incident that I don't think was talked about enough, but in 2016, there was a big hack of a bank called the Bank of Bangladesh. There's a little, there's a code during financial transactions, bank to bank sending money, or you sending money in a bank, that uses an international system so that all banks can talk to each other. It's called SWIFT, okay? In one of these transactions between the Bank of Bangladesh and another entity, the SWIFT system started to look odd to people during the transaction. They said, you know what, something's off here. Off goes the investigation, like so many times, and what's discovered but the malware and traces of what, again, looks to be, in this case, a North Korean heist, so money taken, in this case, millions of dollars, stolen from the Central Bank of Bangladesh. So what we start to see here is the domain taking money, right, crime, which was so frequently the place that we only associated with cyber criminals, sort of guys that weren't associated with the state. They were trying to make money, and off they would go. This is now a place where countries are willing to play and see what they can do at not just a credit card level, at a banking, transactional, financial system level, and that's enormous. Okay, let's get out of the scary stuff for a little bit and start talking about what we do about this, and then also how you get to play in this problem. So, look, we have a lot of different ways that people can use cyberspace negatively, right? We can't even imagine what's going to come next. But what we can do is think of ways to make ourselves more resilient at a personal level, and then figure out how at a government, a society, and an economic level, we're also able to have resilience. When someone says the word resilience in the cybersecurity field, they're usually talking about networks, right? How do I have different layers of network security so that I'm able to see the problem and block it at the host level, at the network level, and all of these different ways in a network? But I challenge you to think a little bit bigger. This isn't just about the resilience of our networks. This is also about the resilience of people, of our ability to say, if you're sitting at, let's say, a government office one day and you say, you know what, something's a little bit off here. I think we need to look into this code. And then, hey, I think we should actually go and share this intelligence with this other group who's been looking at this type of thing. How do you raise that red flag and say, look, I think we have a problem. Let's figure out how to get a critical mass of people who can think about this the right way, share intelligence successfully, and have relationships that you've built where you can start to unpack these things. And don't be scared of the people who have to figure out how to communicate them either. You're going to be in the lucky spot where you understand the technical details that other people aren't going to understand. And that gives you a duty. You've got to figure out how to explain the technical nuance in a way that's clear, truthful, and then also understandable to people who aren't in your sphere. So that's going to be a real challenge that you all are going to have to face as you think about what to do as you jump into the workforce in this field. The next thing on a personal resilience level is this. When we're talking about this information sphere, and we're talking about what the target is, it's not a computer network, right? It's your mind. It's the carbon element. It's people. And I'm not just talking about this about fake news and influence operations and propaganda. I'm also talking about it from a very technical level too. Do you know what the most successful plot is to get you to give your password over? It's an email that's been around for probably 10 years that says, I'm your IT administrator, click here to help me reset your password. It always works, okay? This is how, this phishing is still the way that most companies get compromised, as most agencies get compromised, okay? So is that instinct that something's a little off, right? Is the truth that's being presented to you the truth, or someone else's information that they want you to take as the truth? How do we critically examine and critically think through the information that's in front of us? And how do we decide what we're going to trust and what the basis of our trust is? From information to what you click on. Those are the big problems that we're grappling with right now. We need fresh thinking on it. We need new ways to think about trust in this kind of world. And it's not going to happen overnight, and it's not going to happen from people who don't understand the dynamics of how information is changing. So you're in a lucky spot. All right, I want to go to the last topic here, which is, what do we do given all of these problems, given all of these challenges, given our desire to be resilient, to rebuild trust in light of this kind of information environment? And I think part of the answer lies in how we apply the dividends of all of the data that we're getting, good and bad data, right? All of the data that we're getting from different apps, from consumers, from studies, from governments. How do we do something with that data and apply it in different sectors in a way that's useful? Let me make that real. We've been talking about big data for years in technology. Who hasn't heard of big data, right? No one. Big data, artificial intelligence, machine learning. These are everyone's favorite words, right? But in and of themselves, the crunching of data isn't just what we're after. You have to apply it to something. And so many people are in love with the idea of Silicon Valley because the sort of wizardry, the technical expertise of figuring out how to do things with data that we had never thought of before. Like being able to connect millions of people across the world, Facebook. Being able to sell you pretty much anything, anywhere, anytime, Amazon, right? All of these kind of breakthroughs in how people were connected and how things were sold was sort of the phase one of using big data to do different things. But here's where I think the next phase is going, and here's what I'm excited about. We need people who can think about how to use data in all sorts of industries. Let's take agriculture, okay? There are now low Earth satellites, low orbit satellites, that are able to take pictures of every spot on Earth twice a day. So if there's clouds in the morning, maybe there aren't clouds in the afternoon, you get a picture of a cornfield or a wheat field. When you're able to go and apply data analytics, right, interesting information, on top of these pictures, you can decide what part of your cornfield to water. You can decide where to put pesticides or herbicides, or if your field doesn't need it, or when to harvest it. You can look over an area that's been flooded and see if there's survivors, see what houses are left. I'm giving you the very tip of the iceberg, but my point is, we need people to go and think about how to use data in all sorts of fields with all sorts of problems, not just advertising, not just retail. We need minds like yours who are considering these really big problems to go into these industries and to go in to start solving some of the big problems that we've got next. So thank you so much, and I'm happy to take some questions.